In the timeline where mining and AI have long overtaken the gaming hardware market, and us, humble gamers, are left with crumbs and mistreated by our tech overlords, we at A64 are putting together absolute stinker builds with 10-year-old components for your devious gaming and viewing pleasure. Hello world, Kala with A64. Today we're building and assessing an ITX PC made from a plethora of second-hand finds, and we'll be doing some overclocking, synthetics and also gaming on it in order to determine the real-world performance that you can expect from these components and their worth in relation to similarly priced items. So, let's check the cost. Initially, this build was more of a migration of components from an ATX case to an ITX one, obviously with a different motherboard to fit and a GPU upgrade. But as we started searching for ITX cases, we found almost none that would fit the old PSU, a Corsair VS650 that is 16 cm long. So in the end we decided on a used inWin A1 Plus that came with a proprietary PSU and a missing front panel clip. As for the motherboard, seeing that AM4 ITX models are as rare as hen's teeth on the second-hand market in our region and brand new ones start from €130, we chose a more sensible option and turned to AliExpress in the hopes that the Chinese would offer a more competitive price point. And boy was that right. I introduce to you the Jginyue
Listen properly.
Jginyue B550i. You know it's good when you can't pronounce the name of the thing, but basically it's a Chinese-made motherboard that was €72, including shipping. So quite a bargain I might say, but we'll end up having to change two more components from the system due to this choice, because this motherboard doesn't support Zen or Zen Plus microcode, so there goes the old CPU. And also, the RAM slots are so close to the socket that the old radiator block was brushing against the A2 stick, so that also had to go. And in the end, the only components that survived the migration were the M.2 storage, the RAM, and 4 fans. Coming back to the motherboard, it's actually pretty well equipped for the price. It has 4 3.2 USBs and 2 2.0s, 2 M.2 slots, but only the one on the back is 4.0, 3 chassis fans, and it comes with a reinforced PCIe slot for the GPU and a 1x1 for your network adapter, as well as a beefy radiator for the VRMs, so overall a pretty good package. We'll end up talking about the BIOS later on because they made some, say, questionable choices for it. Moving on, as I said, we're bringing the old RAM kit and M.2 to this build, so a pair of G.Skill Aegis for a total of 16 gigs running 3200 CL16, and the Western Digital SN something that will pop in the front M.2 header because it's only 3.0. Next, the original idea was to also bring the old CPU along for the ride, that being an R5 1600, but as I said, we ran into some issues regarding compatibility on this front, so we ended up buying an R3 4100 because these are dirt cheap nowadays. A brand new one will set you back around €40, and we found this one second hand with a row of bent pins for €30. As for the CPU itself, it's basically a 4300G APU with Vega disabled, so 4 Zen 2 cores and 8 threads, accompanied by a laughably small amount of L cache. And it tops out at 4 GHz, although we'll be seeing later on that that is false, even without any OC. Otherwise, it states 65 watts TDP, and again that is very much a lie. And it compares nicely to the R3 3100, which is basically identical in configuration apart from larger L cache and power consumption, and of course PCIe 4 support, because the 4000 series only supports PCIe 3. In the original configuration with the 1600, we wanted to cool that with a Thermalright King V2 Mini, but after the CPU turned out to be a bust on the new platform, we ended up making different plans for that CPU and cooler combination. So then we thought, okay, we'll just use the old Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo block that we yanked out of the old build for the 4100. But turns out mounting an horizontal radiator block on a 17x17 ITX platform makes your A2 DRAM slot unusable, so we had to reconsider the cooling solution for the CPU. Luckily, we had an ID Cooling SE214XT lying around gathering dust, so we used the radiator block from that and kept the old fan from the Cooler Master, because the ID Cooling one was just overkill for a Ryzen 3, and we also had other plans for it. So to summarize, we are cooling a 4100 with an ID cooling block that has an old Cooler Master 120 fan from 2017 strapped to it. Now for the GPU we have the legendary RX 480, also known as the original RX 590, because that card is a re-released RX 580 that in turn is a re-released RX 480 with a faster core. It just makes me wonder why AMD bothered to change the architecture name from GCN to Polaris, since the GCN series was so successful and made it not at all confusing to figure out what card used what architecture. They might as well have went for 5. Hell, throw in the 2 Vegas and 7 in there and get it to a nice round 10. Wait, they actually did that? But I digress, and as of late AMD has cut funding to the Radeon re-release GPU cloning department and have managed to stay disaster free for a few generations of cards. Ah, damn it AMD. Right, back to the RX 480. I don't know what else I could say about this one, since it's already been beaten to death. It's like a cockroach among GPUs. Short term it just stayed alive because AMD kept shoving it down gamers' throats, and by the time they released convincingly better cards, it became a solid second-hand pick that would run the latest games. Afterwards, crypto miners started picking them up for their efficiency, and you still find people selling these second-hand in bulk from mining rigs. And now, in our Lord's year 2025, they are truly in the bargain bin, with prices ranging from 30 to 40 euro for the 8GB variants. So this card kept hanging in there no matter the times. Now, for the people unfamiliar with the 480, or the broader 400 range, or Arctic Islands, or whatever else AMD calls them, these were basically released just before Pascal from Nvidia, and despite using a newer node, the best from the range, that being the 480, only matched Nvidia's 1060. So if you think that the gap is big nowadays, you should look back at 2016. But I think this just goes to highlight the goated status of Pascal as one of the best architecture for its time. Right, back to the specs of the 480 that are now on screen. We have a 14nm process running with 8GB of GDDR5 VRAM through a 256-bit memory bus, 2304 shading units, 144 TMUs, 32 ROPs and 36 compute units, running at a clock reaching up to 1266 MHz, and the memory running at 2 GHz. Our particular variant is the XFX RX XXX that comes with a plus 22 MHz to the core boost, an 8-pin connector instead of the 6-pin, and an overkill cooling solution which we love to see. Otherwise it's just like any other 480. To cool the system we'll be mounting an additional 3 120 fans, one in the front and one just under the GPU for intake, and one for exhaust at the back. With the components listed, actually building in this case felt like trying to turn a chicken coop into a 5-star hotel, although in the end it turns out okay and the temperatures were impressive for the size, but it's definitely not for beginners. Okay, so that does it for the components and building side of the affair. So let's move on to the overclocking chapter. Quick disclaimer though, the team we used for both the CPU and GPU is the Chinesium GD900, 4.5 watts over meter Kelvin. For the GPU, we got stable 3D Mark performance with the configuration you see on screen right now. So unlocked power limit 1360 peak core with a considerable undervolt, and 2150 for the VRAM with a bit of an undervolt. This got us 4436 points in time spy with a maximum of 60 degrees Celsius and 131 watt power draw. And if you're wondering why 3D Mark thinks this is a 580X, that's just because we are using Radeon ID modded drivers. The first thing we did for the CPU was to unlock PBO, and after a Cinebench run we saw 377 multi with a 77 single core score, whilst the CPU was boosting by itself up to 4.25 GHz without any overclocking, despite it being rated just for 4 GHz boost clock. With everything else left on auto, we saw an average temperature of 67 with peaks to 68 degrees Celsius and a peak power draw of 40 watts. Afterwards, we moved on to 4.3 GHz, PBO unlocked and a set voltage of 1.4 volts, and that got us 389 with 77 in Cinebench, and we saw a 1 degree drop in temperatures and 37.5 watt peak draw. Next was the same configuration but with 4.4 GHz that netted us 400 with 79 Cinebench results, worse thermals and a slight power draw gain. The final frequency we reached was 4.45 GHz at 1.4 volts, although we saw the same Cinebench results and the same thermals, with a slightly higher power draw of 40.2 watts. At this point it just seems like the CPU was drawing more power and doing jack with it. Voltage lower than 1.4 crashed the system, and going to 4.5 GHz was impossible due to the CPU requiring more voltage and that in turn generating more heat then our cooling solution was able to disperse. And that brings me on to the TDP of this chip, and mainly why it's listed at 65 watts, when we can clearly see that it has no right being above 40 watts. Moving on, this overclock also scored pretty well in 3D Mark with 5336 points in TimeSpy, and at that time this was number 6 4100 in TimeSpy. Alright, now the RAM is where it gets miserable, because we have to get back to this motherboard's BIOS in order to explain why I ended up not bothering with RAM OC and just left them on XMP unfortunately. So I'll spell out the list of issues encountered. 1. You have no voltage control over DRAM, only 1.25, 1.35 and auto. 2. You have no option to save your BIOS configuration in external or internal media, so if you fail to boot and have to reset CMOS, you'll also have to rewrite your BIOS. 3. You have no save mode, making point 2 even more of a sore. 4. I don't know what Argesa this is running, since the BIOS says it's running some 2025 version, but on their site they have listed something like 4 BIOS distributions, all from 2023 and 2024 with no notes or changelog, so I guess it's running a BIOS that doesn't exist. 5. The DRAM settings are scoured and split into 4 separate submenus, some of them having duplicate settings with just 1 or 2 specific settings exclusive to the submenu. So when you'll eventually fail to boot to BIOS, the rewriting process will consist of a few solid minutes of you just sifting through all the garbage Jginyue left in their BIOS. And that is all. I truly don't wish an encounter with the BIOS of this motherboard upon my worst enemies. Now let's see how this system fares in the games we tried on it. Starting off with Cyberpunk, we saw 50 FPS average with 1% lows down to 36 FPS during the built-in benchmark with everything set on medium. During normal play, the average would drop down to 47 FPS, but our 1% lows remained the same across the board. Here we saw both the CPU and GPU struggling, and okay frame times meant that Cyberpunk was very much playable on hardware outside its minimum requirements. Moving on to Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, we scored 70 average FPS with 34 FPS 1% lows and just okay frame times. This was with everything set to the max during the game's built-in benchmark. Here we saw that the GPU was able to keep up with all the eye candy, and it was the CPU that was struggling during the large battle, but overall a great showing. Unfortunately, you will not be getting a competitive frame rate in CS2 out of these components, as we marked only 113 FPS on average with 54 FPS 1% lows in the Dust Dupe benchmark using my competitive preset. I'd recommend a system like this only for casual play, and seeing that our frame times were rather good, this would be an enjoyable title to play. Where the system excels is GTA 5 Enhanced. We managed the solid 60 FPS average with 50 to 1% lows on maximum, obviously without ray tracing. Honestly, not much to add to this one. We again saw the GPU being a slight bottleneck, but overall stellar performance. Frame times could have been lower. In Baldur's Gate 3, I think we witnessed a miracle, that being this game running on a Radeon card in Vulkan mode on Windows. I don't know what the Radeon ID team did to the drivers for this to work, but we should be grateful. With maximum settings, on average we got 48 FPS with 1% lows down to 32 FPS and manageable frame times for this kind of title. This just highlights this game's optimization, and that the old 480 still got it in somewhat recent titles. One other thing to add is that this game would just crash with any GPU core OC, so the performance you're seeing is with the memory OC alone, and this will also be the case for our next title. Before we move on to the heavier 2025 titles, let's do a sanity check with the original Crysis, and as expected we are met with excellent results. 74 average FPS, 46 1% lows, and amazing frame times on maximum settings DirectX 10. Now onto the heavy hitters, starting with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which uses just like the previous game the Cry engine, albeit a new version of it. During play we saw 43 average FPS and 1% lows down to 37 FPS with all medium settings and maximum anti-aliasing. This would have been an impressive showing were it not for borderline crippling frame times for this kind of game. Interestingly, the CPU was just chilling while the heavy lifting was done by the GPU. Overall, I'd call this playable performance considering we are well outside the game's minimum required specs, and the graphics were amazing with the settings tested. Next, we have Assetto Corsa Evo, running with nothing turned off, but everything on low. We scored 56 FPS on average with 49.1% lows, and considering this game looks quite good on low, and the frame times we were getting were passable, I reckon this is a valid budget configuration to play this title, even though again we are below minimum requirements. Finally, to top it all off, we tried running Unreal Engine 5 with Oblivion Remaster, and this was by far the worst performance from the benchmarks. We chose medium settings for it, because the 1993 Doom looks better than this game on low, and after the game threw an error that I first thought was to do with the GPU, but actually said that it doesn't support our quad-core, and then launched anyways to a solid 15-minute shader preloading loading screen. After all of that, we got into the game to appraise 35 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 26 and less than ideal frame times. Now, this was to be expected as we are well underneath the minimum required specs, but I'll go out on a limb and say that I rate this as playable if you don't mind the input latency during combat. Also, we found the CPU error on launch to be unfounded because during gameplay you'd be hard pressed to find CPU utilization ever go above 60%. So it really seems that the bottleneck was the GPU all along. Well, apart from Bannerlord. Now, to round it all up, let's go one by one. The straightforward ones are the case and the motherboard. The A1 Plus looks good and offers great thermals for how crammed it is, but building inside of it is a nightmare. And the Chinese motherboard, yes, it's very affordable for what it offers and has great build quality, but God forbid you have to do more than change the boot order in the BIOS. The 41000 offers stellar gaming performance for a €30 quad-core. What's left to be said about it is that for casual gaming it seems that you don't need more than 4 good cores, and AMD should reconsider the removal of the quad-core from below the 6-core as a budget offering, seeing that both Zen 4 and 5 range are void of this option as of right now. And finally, the 480 has proven to be one of the best bang for the buck graphics cards around, and overall I say this build offers, as I have proven, respectable performance for what it is, and it also looks great courtesy of the A1 Plus. If you want even better performance on a looser budget, you could go for a 6-core Zen 2 CPU, as the single-core performance of Zen 2 is already plenty enough. And as for graphics cards, I guess try finding either one of the Vegas, even though they usually go for around double the price of GCN or Polaris, but they are still cheaper than the 1070. And that would be all that I wanted to talk about regarding this build. I'm sure you've noticed that we switched to the lingua franca for this video, and it will probably remain like this for the up and coming future of this channel. Also, stay tuned for our next one, which will be about the CPU and cooler that we failed to incorporate into this ITX build. And speaking of, if you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching.